Tonight, we journey not into myth or legend, but into harsh historical reality. A world where your morning routine could kill you, where a simple cut might mean death, and where the very water you drink carries disease. We explore the medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, a time when daily survival required skills you almost certainly do not possess. Before we begin this descent into the unforgiving world of the Middle Ages, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And would you genuinely survive even a single week in medieval times? Because by the end of this exploration, you will understand why the answer is almost certainly no. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to appreciate every modern convenience you have ever taken for granted. Let us explore together why you would not last a day in medieval times. The romantic lie we tell ourselves when you picture the medieval period. What comes to mind? Perhaps you imagine knights in shining armor, grand feasts in torchlit halls, maidens in flowing gowns, and noble quests. Hollywood and fantasy literature have painted the Middle Ages with a romantic brush, transforming centuries of brutal human existence into entertaining spectacle. But the reality was far different from these polished images. The medieval world was not a time of adventure and romance for the overwhelming majority of people who lived through it. It was a daily battle for survival, where comfort was a luxury almost no one could afford, where pain was constant, and where death lurked around every corner. The term medieval times itself encompasses roughly 1,000 years of European history, from approximately 450 to 1450. This sprawling period saw dramatic changes in society, technology, and culture, yet certain harsh realities remained consistent throughout. Life was difficult, dangerous, and for most people, mercifully short. For this exploration, we will focus primarily on England and Western Europe during what historians call the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th through 13th centuries, though we will venture into earlier and later periods when relevant. This was an era before antibiotics, before modern agriculture, before the printing press, before the scientific revolution. It was a time when the church dominated every aspect of life, when feudalism chained people to the land, and when the gap between how you imagine medieval life and how it actually was could not be wider. You need to understand something fundamental before we go further. Around 85% of the medieval population were peasants, not knights, not nobility, not merchants, or craftsmen, peasants, people who worked the land with their hands, who lived in conditions you would find intolerable, who endured hardships you can scarcely imagine. And if you traveled back in time to medieval England, that is exactly what you would be, a peasant, because the odds of being anything else were vanishingly small. So let us begin with perhaps the most immediate shock you would face: the sanitation, or rather, the complete lack of it. The sanitation nightmare. You wake up in your medieval peasant home. The sun has not yet risen, but you need to relieve yourself. You reach for your phone to use as a flashlight, but there is no phone. There is no electricity. There is no indoor plumbing. There is no bathroom. Instead, you have choices, all of them unpleasant. If you are fortunate enough to live in a slightly better peasant dwelling, you might have a chamber pot, a ceramic or metal container kept in your sleeping area. You would use this during the night, then carry it outside in the morning to empty it. Where would you empty it? Into a cesspit, if you had one. Into the street, if you did not. this was not uncommon. Despite laws against throwing waste into the streets, these regulations were frequently ignored. In villages and rural areas, peasants typically used cesspits, large holes dug in the ground near their homes. Some families might share a small wooden structure built over these pits, offering minimal privacy and even less comfort. Without anything resembling toilet paper, people made do with whatever they could find: moss, leaves, straw, scraps of cloth, or simply their hands. After using the cesspit, you would return to your daily activities. Hand washing was not the automatic habit it is today, and clean water was not always readily available. For those living in towns and cities, the situation grew even more challenging. Some urban areas had public latrines, simple structures with multiple seats where people relieved themselves side by side. Privacy was not a medieval concept. One public latrine in London had 2 rows of 64 seats each. Imagine using a bathroom with 63 other people simultaneously. These public facilities, when positioned over rivers or streams, would dump waste directly into the water. When not near running water, they connected to cesspits that required regular emptying. This job fell to workers known as gong farmers or rakers, who would arrive at night to clean out the accumulated filth. This was one of the most despised occupations in medieval society. Though it paid reasonably well, for obvious reasons, the wealthier classes had slightly better arrangements. Castles featured garderobes, small rooms built into the walls with a hole in the floor. Waste would drop down a shaft, either into a moat, into a river, or into a designated area outside the castle walls. These shafts were etiquette guides advised washing hands and face, keeping nails trimmed, and not appearing at table with dirty hands. Full baths happened less frequently than today. Evidence suggests that some peasants may have bathed several times per week when circumstances allowed, while others bathed only a few times per year. The often repeated claim that peasants bathed only twice in their lives, once at birth and once at death, seems to have been an exaggeration meant to emphasize poor conditions rather than literal fact. That said, bathing more frequently was genuinely difficult, and there were periods when excessive bathing was discouraged by religious authorities, who associated public bathhouses with immorality. Towns often had public bathhouses where multiple people would share the same bathwater. These establishments gained unsavory reputations as they became associated with prostitution and vice. King Henry VIII eventually closed many bathhouses in London, partly for moral reasons and partly due to fears about disease spread. The wealthy bathed more frequently, with servants heating and hauling water for private tubs. But even for them, a bath was an occasional luxury rather than a daily routine. Perfumes and scented oils became popular among the upper classes, partly to mask body odor. Without modern soap, proper hygiene was nearly impossible. Soap existed in the medieval period. It was made from animal fat and wood ash, creating a harsh, caustic substance quite different from modern soap. But it was expensive and not widely available to the common people. Most made do with plain water, perhaps with some herbs added for scent. This poor hygiene had consequences beyond discomfort. Skin infections were common. Lice were endemic. Nearly everyone had them. Rich and poor alike scratched at lice in their hair, in their clothes, in their bedding. Fleas were equally ubiquitous. These parasites were not merely annoying, they were vectors for disease. The fleas that lived on rats would eventually carry the bacterium that caused the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in European history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we discuss the plague, we need to understand the broader landscape of disease in medieval times. Because if the sanitation did not kill you, the diseases almost certainly would. Disease and death around every corner. Let us say you are a woman in medieval England. You have just learned you are pregnant. In the modern world, this would be a moment of joy, tempered perhaps by normal concerns about parenthood. In medieval times, you have just received what might be a death sentence. Approximately 20% of women died in childbirth during the medieval period, 1 in 5. These deaths occurred from complications we can easily treat today: hemorrhaging, infection, obstructed labor, preeclampsia. Without modern medicine, these conditions were often fatal. If you survived the birth, your newborn faced even worse odds. Infant mortality rates in medieval England were staggering. Roughly 50% of children died before reaching their first birthday. Half of all babies born would not see their first birthday. The causes were numerous: infectious diseases, malnutrition, accidents, birth defects that might be treatable today. Parents in medieval times expected to lose children. It was not a question of if, but how many. If a child survived to age 5, their chances improved somewhat, but childhood remained perilous. By age 12, perhaps 30% of those born would have died. Think about that. Of every 10 babies born, only 7 would reach adolescence. This extraordinarily high child mortality rate was one of the defining features of medieval life. For those who survived childhood, life expectancy was still brutally short. The average for men was approximately 28 years. For women, 29 years. These numbers are somewhat skewed by high infant mortality. If you made it to 21, you might reasonably expect to live into your 40s or even 50s. But many people did not make it to 21. The diseases that plagued medieval Europe were numerous and often deadly. Let us start with the most infamous, the Black Death, in 1347. A pandemic of bubonic plague arrived in Europe via trading ships from the east. Within 7 years, it had killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. Some estimates suggest as many as 50 million people died. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348. Historical records indicate it spread with horrifying speed across the country. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, though the exact transmission mechanisms during medieval outbreaks remain debated by scholars even today. While flea-borne transmission from rats is well established, some modern research has suggested that person-to-person spread through body lice and respiratory droplets may have played a more significant role during the second pandemic than previously thought. The symptoms were horrifying. Victims developed buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, or neck that could grow as large as eggs. These buboes were intensely painful. Fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and terrible pain followed. Dark patches appeared on the skin, giving the disease its name. From first symptoms to death typically took 3 days. There was no cure, no treatment. Medieval physicians tried everything. They attempted to lance the buboes, to drain them. They prescribed herbs, special diets, bloodletting. They recommended fleeing to the countryside, avoiding bad air, carrying flowers to ward off evil smells. None of it worked. The plague killed indiscriminately, rich and poor, young and old, pious and sinful. no one was safe. Some who caught the plague survived. Historical evidence suggests survival rates varied considerably depending on the form of the disease, with some estimates indicating that up to 30% or more of bubonic plague victims might recover. However, many who recovered were left weakened, scarred, or crippled, and the plague kept returning. After the initial outbreak of the Black Death, plague epidemics returned to England roughly every 10 to 15 years for the next 3 centuries. Each outbreak killed thousands, but plague was only one of many diseases. Tuberculosis was endemic in medieval Europe. This bacterial infection of the lungs caused a slow, wasting death. Victims would cough blood, grow progressively weaker, and eventually succumb. There was no treatment. Tuberculosis remained a major killer well into the 20th century, not conquered until antibiotics were developed. Leprosy was another scourge. This disfiguring disease caused skin lesions, nerve damage, and progressive disability. Lepers were considered unclean, both physically and spiritually. They were forced to live in isolation in leper colonies outside towns. When walking in public, they had to ring bells to warn others of their approach. The disease carried enormous social stigma. Being diagnosed with leprosy meant being cast out from society, separated from your family, left to survive on charity. Smallpox killed millions throughout the medieval period. This viral disease caused fever and a distinctive rash of fluid-filled pustules covering the body. Many victims died. Those who survived were often left permanently scarred and sometimes blind. No treatment existed. Smallpox would continue killing until vaccination was developed in the 18th century. Typhus, spread by body lice, caused fever, headache, and a rash. In crowded, unsanitary conditions, typhus spread rapidly. It was known as jail fever because it ran rampant in prisons, but it affected the general population as well, particularly during times of war or famine when hygiene declined even further. Dysentery, a severe intestinal infection, caused bloody diarrhea, fever, and abdominal pain. It spread through contaminated water and food. In the absence of clean water and proper sanitation, dysentery was common and often fatal, particularly to children and the elderly. Ergotism, also called St. Anthony's fire, resulted from eating grain contaminated with ergot fungus. Symptoms included hallucinations, seizures, and gangrene of the extremities. Entire villages could be affected when contaminated grain entered the food supply. Limbs would literally rot and fall off. The pain was described as feeling like burning alive. Scabies, a skin infestation caused by mites, was nearly universal. The intense itching it caused was maddening. Scratching would break the skin, leading to infections. There was no effective treatment. Parasitic worms were endemic. Roundworms, tapeworms, and other parasites lived in the intestines of most medieval people. They caused malnutrition, abdominal pain, and various complications. You would certainly have intestinal parasites if you lived in medieval times. Dental problems were universal and excruciating. Without modern dentistry, cavities, abscesses, and gum disease caused constant pain. The bread that formed the staple of the medieval diet was particularly hard on teeth. It was gritty from the millstones used to grind grain, wearing down tooth enamel quickly. By middle age, if you reached it, you would likely have lost many teeth. Abscessed teeth could cause infections that spread to the jaw and brain, killing you in agony. And what medical treatment could you expect for these various ailments? The answer is almost none that would actually help. Medieval medicine was based on the theories of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, particularly Galen and Hippocrates. The dominant theory was that of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health required these humors to be in balance. Illness meant they were out of balance. Treatment aimed to restore balance. The most common medical procedure was bloodletting. Physicians believed that many diseases were caused by excess blood. The treatment was to drain some out. This was done by opening a vein with a lancet or by applying leeches. Bloodletting weakened patients at precisely the moment they needed strength to fight illness. It made outcomes worse, not better. Yet it remained standard medical practice for centuries. Physicians prescribed various herbal remedies, and modern research suggests that some of these actually had genuine therapeutic properties. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicylic acid, the basis for aspirin. Honey has antibacterial properties and was used effectively on wounds. However, many prescribed remedies were useless or actively harmful, and the overall theoretical framework based on humors was fundamentally flawed. For the plague specifically, physicians tried numerous treatments. They recommended fleeing to the countryside to escape bad air. They prescribed special diets, particular combinations of foods thought to balance the humors. They created medicines from crushed emeralds, powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, and other exotic ingredients. They recommended vinegar baths, burning aromatic woods, carrying flowers or herbs. They suggested lancing buboes to drain the pus, then packing the wounds with dried toads or the excrement of various animals. None of these treatments worked. Surgery was primitive and horrifyingly dangerous. Anesthesia did not exist. Surgical patients were given alcohol or opium to dull the pain, but they remained conscious throughout. Surgeons worked quickly, amputating limbs in minutes because patients could not endure. Much more, the pain was unimaginable. Infection after surgery was almost guaranteed. Most surgical patients died. For childbirth, women were attended by midwives rather than physicians. Midwives had practical experience, but no medical training. If complications arose, there was little that could be done. Cesarean sections were performed only as a last resort to save the baby when the mother was already dead or dying. The procedure was almost always fatal to the mother. Mental illness was not understood at all. People suffering from mental health conditions were thought to be possessed by demons or cursed by God. Treatment involved prayer, exorcism, or confinement. The idea that mental illness could have physical causes and might be treated was centuries in the future. Living in medieval times, you would be in constant pain, a toothache, a headache, joint pain from hard labor, stomach pain from poor diet and parasites. There would be no relief, no painkillers beyond alcohol and opium if you could afford them. Most people simply endured pain as an inescapable part of life, and you would watch people you loved die. Your spouse might die in childbirth or from disease. Your children would likely die in infancy or childhood. Your siblings, your parents, your neighbors. Death was omnipresent. Funerals were frequent. Grief was constant. The average person in medieval times experienced a level of suffering that would break most modern people within days. And we have not even discussed what you would eat, or rather, what you would struggle to find to eat. Food, famine, and starvation. You are hungry. You have been hungry for weeks. Your stomach aches with emptiness. You feel weak, lightheaded. Your children cry from hunger. But the harvest failed this year. The winter was too harsh, the spring too wet, the summer too cold. The crops rotted in the fields. The grain stores are running low, and you do not know if you will survive until next harvest. Famine was a recurring nightmare in medieval Europe. Between 1210 and 1350, approximately half of the years experienced poor harvests. About a quarter of these were severe enough to be classified as famine years. If you lived to 40, you would experience severe food shortage multiple times in your life. You might well face actual starvation. The most devastating famine of the medieval period was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. After 2 years of cold, wet weather, crops across northern Europe failed catastrophically. Food prices skyrocketed. People ate anything they could find. They slaughtered their livestock, including breeding animals, ensuring future shortages. They consumed seed grain that should have been saved for next year's planting, guaranteeing the famine would continue. They scoured forests for nuts, roots, bark, anything edible. They boiled grass and weeds. Contemporary chronicles describe desperate people fighting over scraps, stealing food, eating dead animals. Some accounts mention cannibalism, though historians continue to debate whether these reports represented literal truth or rhetorical exaggeration meant to emphasize the severity of conditions. What remains undisputed is the genuine desperation. Evidence suggests that as many as 10% of Northern Europe's population died during the Great Famine. But let us assume you live during a year when the harvest is adequate. What would you eat? Bread. Lots and lots of bread. Historical records suggest that bread was the foundation of the medieval diet for peasants. For most people, bread likely provided somewhere between 60 to 70% of their daily calories, though this would have varied by region and economic status. You would eat bread at every meal: breakfast, midday meal, evening meal. Bread with everything. Bread alone if times were hard. The quality of your bread depended on your social status and what grain was available. The finest bread, white bread made from wheat with the bran removed, was reserved for the wealthy. Most peasants ate darker, coarser bread made from rye, barley, oats, or a mixture called maslin. In the worst times, bread might be made with dried peas, or flour mixed with sawdust and chaff swept from the bakery floor. Medieval bread was hard and dense. It kept for weeks without spoiling, which was necessary since baking was labor-intensive and done infrequently. The bread was so hard that it was often torn into pieces and soaked in soup or stew to soften it before eating. Sometimes thick slices of stale bread served as plates called trenchers, which would soak up the juices of whatever food was placed on them. After the meal, the bread trencher might be eaten, or more often, given to the poor or to animals. Accompanying your bread, you would eat pottage. This was a thick soup or stew made from whatever vegetables and grains you had available: peas, beans, lentils, cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips. If you were fortunate, you might add small amounts of meat or bones for flavoring. Pottage simmered constantly over the fire, with new ingredients added as they became available. The same pot might be kept going for days or weeks, its contents evolving. Vegetables were an important part of the peasant diet, but the variety was limited compared to modern times. Tomatoes, potatoes, and corn had not yet been introduced from the Americas. Peasants grew peas, beans, cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, and turnips in small gardens near their homes. They foraged for wild plants, mushrooms, berries, and nuts. But in winter, fresh vegetables largely disappeared from the diet. Fruit was consumed when in season. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, and strawberries all grew in England. But without refrigeration or canning, fruit was available only briefly each year. Some fruit could be preserved by drying or by making it into preserves with honey. But honey was expensive. Meat was a luxury for most peasants. You would not eat meat regularly, perhaps a few times per month, or only on special occasions. When you did eat meat, it would most likely be pork from pigs, which were relatively easy to keep. Chickens provided eggs, which were more valuable than the birds themselves. You might occasionally have beef, mutton, or goat. If you lived near the coast or a river, fish was more accessible and formed a major part of the diet, especially during Lent and other religious fasting periods when eating land animals was forbidden. Hunting in the Lord's forest was strictly forbidden to peasants. Deer, wild boar, and other game animals were reserved for the nobility. Poaching was punishable by severe penalties, including mutilation or death. You could not simply go into the woods and hunt for food. The woods belonged to someone else, and the animals in them were not yours to take. Dairy products were important when available. Cheese, butter, and milk from cows, goats, or sheep supplemented the diet. But milk spoiled quickly in warm weather, so cheese and butter were more practical for storage. Eggs from chickens were valuable and consumed regularly by those who kept hens. You would consume very little sugar. Honey was the primary sweetener, but it was expensive and used sparingly. The concept of dessert, as we know it, did not exist for peasants. If you wanted something sweet, you ate fruit when it was in season, or perhaps a small cake made with honey on special occasions. Salt was essential for preserving meat and fish, but it was also expensive. The high price of salt meant that food often had to be preserved by other methods, smoking or drying. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger were wildly expensive, imported from distant lands. Only the wealthy could afford them. Your food would be bland by modern standards, seasoned only with herbs you could grow or forage, onions, garlic, maybe some salt if you could afford it. Food preservation was critical to surviving winter. Without refrigeration, meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried immediately after slaughter. In autumn, before winter, animals were slaughtered because feeding them through the cold months was too expensive. This meant a brief period of meat availability, followed by months of eating preserved meat, or none at all. Vegetables were preserved by drying or, less commonly, by pickling in brine or vinegar. Grain was stored in granaries, where it had to be kept dry to prevent rot and protected from rodents. Fruit was dried or preserved in honey. These preservation methods kept food edible, but often at the cost of nutritional value and taste. The medieval diet was heavily influenced by the church calendar. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, eating meat was forbidden. Many other days throughout the year were designated as fast days when meat was prohibited. Fish was allowed on these days, which is why fish was so important in the medieval diet. For peasants, these religious restrictions probably made little difference, since they rarely ate meat anyway. But the religious regulation of diet was taken seriously. Nutritional deficiencies were common. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruit, particularly in winter, meant that vitamin C deficiency was widespread. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, produced bleeding gums, loosening teeth, and easy bruising. Iron deficiency anemia was common, especially among women who suffered from frequent pregnancies and childbirth. This anemia contributed to the high maternal mortality rate. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more vulnerable to disease. Contaminated food was another danger. Grain could become moldy or infected with ergot fungus. Meat that was inadequately preserved would spoil. Without understanding bacterial contamination, food poisoning was common. Symptoms ranged from mild stomach upset to severe illness and death. And remember, you would need to pay a tithe to the church. 10% of everything you produced went to the church. A tenth of your grain, your vegetables, your eggs, your livestock. This was not optional. It was mandatory. The church built enormous barns, called tithe barns, to store all the produce collected from peasants. If you were already struggling to feed your family, losing 10% of your harvest could mean the difference between survival and starvation. You would also owe rent and dues to your lord. These could be paid in produce, in labor, or in cash. The combination of tithes and rents meant that a substantial portion of what you produced went to others. You kept what remained. And if that was not enough to feed your family through winter, you went hungry. Water safety was a constant concern, as we discussed earlier. You would drink ale, watered-down ale for children, because the water was unsafe. This added calories to your diet, which was necessary given the physical demands of your life. But it also meant living in a state of perpetual mild intoxication. The combination of poor nutrition, unsafe water, and food scarcity meant that your body would be constantly stressed. You would be smaller than modern people, your growth stunted by childhood malnutrition. Your immune system would be weakened. Your teeth would decay rapidly from the gritty bread. Your stomach would hurt frequently from parasites and poor diet. And you would always be aware that next year's harvest might fail and hunger might return. But to earn your daily bread, such as it was, you would need to work harder than you have ever worked in your life. Backbreaking labor from dawn to dusk. The rooster crows. It is still dark outside, but you must rise. In summer, the sun rises as early as 3:30 or 4 in the morning. Your workday begins with the sun, or even before it. There is no sleeping in. There are no days off. Work defines every waking hour of your existence. You are a peasant farmer. This is what the vast majority of medieval people were. Your life revolves around the agricultural calendar, an endless cycle of plowing, planting, tending, and harvesting. The work is physical, exhausting, and never-ending. If you are a man, your primary work involves field labor. In spring, you must plow the fields. Medieval plows were heavy wooden implements pulled by oxen. If you were fortunate enough to own oxen, you would guide them back and forth across the field, the plow breaking up the hard-packed earth. If you did not own oxen, you might share ownership with neighbors, or you might pull the plow yourself, harnessed like an animal, straining against the weight. Plowing was backbreaking work. The fields had to be turned before planting could begin. This meant walking miles behind the plow, controlling the oxen, keeping the furrows straight. Your muscles would ache. Your hands would blister and callous. This was just the beginning. After plowing came sowing. Seeds had to be scattered across the prepared fields. You would walk the rows, broadcasting seed by hand, trying to distribute it evenly, not too thick, not too sparse. The success of your family's survival depended on these seeds growing. Through spring and summer, the crops required constant attention. Fields had to be weeded. This meant long hours bent over, pulling weeds by hand under the hot sun. Your back would scream with pain. Crops had to be protected from birds and animals. Children might be sent to chase birds away during planting season, throwing stones and making noise to frighten them. Irrigation required hauling water from rivers or wells if the rains did not come. Fences and hedges had to be maintained to keep livestock out of the crops. Tools had to be repaired. Everything had to be done by hand. Everything required physical labor. In late summer and early autumn came harvest, the most critical and most labor-intensive time of year. The entire community would work together to bring in the crops before weather could ruin them. Grain was cut with sickles or scythes, bent over, cutting close to the ground, hour after hour, day after day, moving down the rows. The cut grain was tied into sheaves, stacked, and left to dry. Then it had to be transported to barns for storage. Threshing separated grain from chaff. This was done by beating the cut grain with flails on a hard floor. More backbreaking labor, swinging the flail over and over, separating the precious grain from the inedible parts of the plant. Then the grain had to be winnowed, tossed in the air so the wind would blow away the chaff while the heavier grain fell back down. All of this was done by hand. All of it required tremendous physical effort, and it had to be done quickly before rain could ruin the harvest, before frost could kill the crops. If you were a woman, your labor was no less demanding, only different. You would manage the household, which meant far more than it does today. You would cook, which required maintaining a fire, hauling water, preparing ingredients without any labor-saving devices. You would brew ale, which was a complex, time-consuming process. You would tend the vegetable garden, raise chickens, and perhaps pigs, milk cows or goats, spin wool into thread, weave cloth, sew and mend clothing, wash clothes without running water or soap, care for children, and likely assist in the fields during critical times like harvest. Medieval women worked more hours than men, according to contemporary accounts. They were expected to do all the household labor in addition to helping with field work. There was no concept of work-life balance. There was only work, and you would owe labor to your Lord. Several days each week, perhaps 3, you would be required to work on the Lord's domain, his personal land. You would plow his fields, plant his crops, harvest his grain, repair his roads and bridges, and perform whatever other tasks he demanded. This labor was uncompensated. It was part of your obligation as a serf or tenant. You worked for free for your Lord, and only after meeting that obligation could you work on your own land to feed your own family. You would also be required to perform boon work, additional unpaid labor at critical times. During harvest, you might owe extra days of work on the Lord's land, taking you away from your own harvest. You had no choice in this. Your Lord's crops came first. The tools available to you were primitive. Plows were wooden, often tipped with iron, but heavy and difficult to manage. Scythes and sickles for harvesting were simple but effective, though they required skill to use properly. Axes, hammers, saws, these basic tools were treasured possessions, expensive to purchase and maintain. A good axe could make the difference between surviving winter with enough firewood and freezing to death. There were no machines to ease your labor, no tractors, no combines, no power tools. Everything was muscle-powered. Your muscles, or those of your oxen. Work that modern machinery can complete in hours took days or weeks of human effort. The work schedule was relentless. In summer, you worked from sunup to sundown, which could mean 15 or 16 hours of labor. In winter, the days were shorter, but there was still work to be done. Firewood had to be gathered and split. Animals had to be tended. Tools had to be made and repaired. Threshing continued. Even in the coldest months, you could not simply rest. There were no weekends in the modern sense. Sunday was a holy day, and work was technically prohibited. You were required to attend church, but necessary work, like feeding animals and maintaining fires, still had to be done, and your lord might demand labor on other days, regardless of whether it was supposed to be a day of rest. There were holy days throughout the year when work was forbidden, and the community might celebrate with slightly better food and perhaps some leisure activities. These feast days provided brief respites from constant labor, but they were not numerous enough to constitute real rest. Children began working as soon as they were capable. By age 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute to the household. They would chase birds, gather firewood, help with cooking, care for younger siblings, feed animals. As they grew older, their responsibilities increased. By adolescence, they were performing adult labor. Childhood as a protected period of education and play did not exist for peasant children. The physical toll of this labor was immense. Your body would be shaped by work. Your hands would be rough, calloused, scarred. Your back would ache constantly from bending over crops. Your joints would develop arthritis early from repetitive strain. You would suffer injuries, cuts, bruises, broken bones from accidents with tools or animals. Without proper medical care, these injuries would heal poorly, leaving you with chronic pain and disability. You would age rapidly. Hard labor and poor nutrition would make you look decades older than your actual years. A 30-year-old peasant would appear middle-aged by modern standards. By 40, if you lived that long, you would be considered old, your body worn out from decades of unceasing toil. And at the end of each exhausting day, you would return to your home, which was not the comfortable refuge you might imagine. Your horrific living conditions, the structure you call home, is small, dark, and utterly inadequate. Most peasant houses in medieval England consisted of a single room, perhaps 15 to 20 feet on each side. This is where your entire family lives. You, your spouse, your children, and quite possibly your parents or other relatives. 7, 8, or more people sharing one room. There is no privacy. There is nowhere to be alone. Every moment of your life is spent in the company of others. The walls of your house are constructed using a technique called wattle and daub. Wooden poles are woven together with smaller branches to create a lattice framework. This is then plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, animal dung, and straw. When it dries, it forms relatively solid walls. But these walls are not waterproof. Rain can seep through, especially as the structure ages and cracks develop. Wind can whistle through gaps. The structure provides shelter, but not complete protection from the elements. The floor is dirt, just packed earth. If you are slightly more prosperous, you might have straw or rushes scattered on the floor to provide some insulation and absorb moisture. Herbs might be mixed into the straw to provide a more pleasant smell, though this does little to mask the reality of living on a dirt floor. Any spills, Any accidents, any animal waste simply soaks into the ground beneath your feet. In some slightly better homes, particularly in later medieval periods, wooden floorboards might be installed. This was a significant improvement, allowing the floor to be swept clean and keeping moisture away from the living area. But many peasants never experienced this luxury. For them, the dirt floor was a reality they simply lived with. The roof is thatched, made from bundled straw or reeds. Thatching provides decent insulation and is reasonably waterproof when properly maintained. But it requires regular repair and replacement. Thatching deteriorates over time, developing leaks. Rain drips through. Snow can find its way in. And thatched roofs harbor insects and rodents. Mice, rats, and various bugs live in the thatch above your head. You can hear them moving around at night. There are few windows, if any. Glass windows are far beyond your means. Glass is expensive, available only to the wealthy. Your home might have 1 or 2 small openings in the walls, perhaps covered with shutters that can be closed to keep out wind and rain. But this means your home is dark. The only light comes from the doorway and perhaps a small smoke hole in the roof. Inside your home, a fire burns on a hearth in the center of the room. This fire is essential. It provides heat in winter, cooks your food, and gives light. But there is no chimney in most peasant homes, at least not in earlier periods. The smoke rises to the ceiling and escapes through a hole in the roof. The room is chronically smoky. Your eyes water. You cough. Everything in the house is coated in soot. The smoke-blackened timbers of the roof are visible overhead. Respiratory problems from constant smoke inhalation are common. In later medieval periods, some homes began to feature chimneys and fireplaces built into the walls. This was a dramatic improvement, removing much of the smoke from the living area. But for much of the medieval period, smoky interiors were simply accepted as normal. Your furniture is minimal. A wooden table, some benches or stools, perhaps a chest for storing your few possessions. Beds might be wooden frames with rope lattice, supporting mattresses stuffed with straw or rushes. More commonly, you simply sleep on straw pallets on the floor. Blankets are wool, coarse and scratchy, but necessary in the cold. Your mattress, such as it is home to countless parasites, bedbugs, lice, fleas. They bite you while you sleep. You wake up with red, itchy welts covering your skin. There is no way to eliminate these pests. You simply live with them. Everyone does. The constant itching is maddening, but it is normal. You share your home with animals, particularly in winter. Pigs might live in a corner of the room, or in a small partitioned area. Chickens roost inside. In truly harsh weather, even larger animals, like cows or goats, might be brought inside. The animals provide warmth and keeping them inside protects your valuable livestock from theft or death from cold. But they also defecate on the floor, adding to the smell and filth of your living space. The smell in your home is overpowering by modern standards. Unwashed bodies, animal waste, spoiled food, smoke, all mingled into a thick, almost physical presence. You grow accustomed to it because you have no choice, but it never goes away. There is no running water. If you want water, you must go to a well or stream and carry it back in buckets. This is heavy, exhausting work, particularly in winter, when ice must sometimes be broken on the water's surface. Every drop of water in your home has been carried there by hand. Temperature regulation is primitive. In winter, your home is cold, The fire provides some warmth, but not enough to heat the entire space. You huddle near the fire when you can. At night, you pile on every bit of clothing and every blanket you own. Still, you shiver. Your breath fogs in the air. Ice can form on the inside walls of your home. People, especially the elderly and children, often froze to death in winter. In summer, your home is stifling. The thick walls and thatched roof provide some insulation, but on hot days, the interior becomes oppressive. There is no air conditioning, no fans. You simply endure the heat. Ventilation is poor. The smoke hole and perhaps a window opening provide some air circulation, but not much. The air inside your home is stale, thick with smoke and smells. Your few possessions are precious. You might have a cooking pot, a few wooden bowls and spoons, perhaps a knife. Clothing is minimal, a tunic or dress, an outer cloak, maybe a change of clothes if you are fortunate. Shoes, if you have them, are simple leather pieces tied around your feet. Many people went barefoot much of the time. Everything you own could fit in a single chest with room to spare. Privacy does not exist. You dress, undress, bathe, and perform bodily functions in full view of your family. Marital relations happen while children sleep nearby. Personal space is a concept that does not exist in your world. Disease spreads easily in these cramped, unsanitary conditions. If one family member becomes ill, everyone else will likely catch it. The close quarters ensure that contagious diseases pass rapidly through the household. The entire structure is vulnerable to fire, with open flames constantly burning for heat and light. Surrounded by flammable materials like straw and thatched roofing, fires were a constant danger. If your home caught fire, it would burn quickly and completely. You would lose everything. Your home provides shelter from rain and some protection from cold. It is a place to sleep, to eat, to exist. But by modern standards, it is barely habitable. It would be condemned as unfit for human occupation. Yet this was normal. This was home for the vast majority of medieval people. And if you think the church or the legal system would provide comfort or protection in this hard life, you are mistaken. Because medieval justice was as harsh as medieval living conditions. The brutal justice system, you have been accused of stealing bread from the local baker. You did not do it. You were nowhere near the bakery when the theft occurred. But someone saw you in that part of town earlier, and the baker insists you are guilty. Your protests of innocence mean nothing. In medieval England, there was no police force. Law enforcement was a community responsibility. If a crime occurred, the victim or a witness would raise the hue and cry, shouting to alert neighbors. Every man over the age of 12 was obligated to join the pursuit of the criminal. This informal system worked for catching criminals in the act, but it did nothing to ensure that the person caught was actually guilty. The legal system varied considerably over the medieval period and between regions. But certain features were consistent. Justice was swift, harsh, and designed to deter others through fear. There was little concept of rehabilitation. Punishment was about retribution, public deterrence, and maintaining social order. In the early medieval period, trials by ordeal were common. If you were accused of a crime and proclaimed your innocence, you might be subjected to an ordeal to determine guilt. The underlying belief was that God would intervene to protect the innocent and reveal the guilty. In ordeal by fire, you would be required to hold a red-hot iron bar and walk 3 paces. Your hand would then be bandaged. 3 days later, the bandages would be removed. If the wound was healing cleanly, you were declared innocent. If it showed signs of infection, you were guilty. In reality, severe burns almost always became infected in the absence of proper medical care. This ordeal was almost impossible to pass. In ordeal by water, you would be bound and thrown into a body of water that had been blessed by a priest. If you sank, you were innocent, because the pure water accepted you. If you floated, you were guilty, because the water rejected your sinful body. The problem, of course, was that sinking meant drowning. Even if pulled out quickly, the trauma could be deadly. In ordeal by combat, you would fight your accuser. God would grant victory to the person in the right. This strongly favored those who were larger, stronger, and skilled in fighting. The actual guilt or innocence of either party was irrelevant. In 1215, the Church prohibited clergy from participating in ordeals, and the practice began to decline across England and much of Europe. It was gradually replaced by trial by jury over the following decades. This might sound like an improvement, but early juries were not impartial. They were composed of local men who often knew both the accused and the accuser. Personal grudges, family feuds, and social status all influenced verdicts. If you were unpopular, or if the jurors wanted to curry favor with someone powerful, you could be convicted regardless of evidence. Furthermore, if you refused to enter a plea and submit to trial by jury, you could be subjected to pressing. Heavy stones would be placed on your chest, gradually increasing in weight, to force you to plead. Some people died under pressing rather than enter a plea, because if you died without being convicted, your property could not be confiscated. Your family would keep your land and possessions. If convicted, you would lose everything. The types of crimes that could get you in trouble were broad. Theft was common and harshly punished. Stealing food could result in having your hand cut off. Repeat offenders might be hanged. Murder, obviously, was a capital crime, punishable by execution. Adultery, fornication, and other sexual offenses were moral crimes that fell under church courts. Heresy, questioning church doctrine, was among the most serious crimes, punishable by excommunication and potentially by burning at the stake. Poaching, hunting on land owned by nobles, was severely punished. The forests belonged to the king and nobles. The game in them was reserved for their use. If you were caught poaching deer or wild boar, you could be blinded, castrated, have your hands cut off, or be executed. The harshness of these penalties reflected how seriously the nobility protected their hunting rights. Witchcraft accusations were particularly dangerous, especially for women. While formal witch hunts, as we typically think of them, intensified primarily in the early modern period after the medieval era ended. Accusations of sorcery and magic did occur throughout the Middle Ages. By the later medieval period, and especially into the early modern era, witch hunts became widespread. If you were accused of witchcraft, you would be arrested, interrogated, tortured to extract a confession, and then executed, usually by hanging or burning. The evidence against you could be disturbingly thin. A neighbor's cow dying after you argued with them, a child falling ill after you walked past, strange behavior, having a cat. Practically anything could be construed as evidence of witchcraft. Torture was used to extract confessions, particularly in later medieval periods as inquisitorial procedures became more common. The rack stretched your body, slowly pulling your joints apart until tendons and ligaments tore. The thumbscrew crushed your thumbs. The strappado suspended you by your wrists tied behind your back, dislocating your shoulders. These tortures were horrifyingly painful, and they invariably produced confessions. But confessions made under torture are worthless. You would confess to anything to make the pain stop. Public punishment was common. The goal was not only to punish the offender, but to shame them and deter others. The stocks and pillory were used for minor offenses. The offender would be locked in a wooden frame in a public square, unable to move or defend themselves. Passersby would mock them, throw rotten food, spit on them. This public humiliation was considered a valid punishment. Flogging was common. You would be tied to a post and whipped, often until your back was bloody. This would happen in public, ensuring everyone witnessed your punishment. Branding marked criminals permanently. A letter might be burned into your forehead or cheek. T for thief, M for murderer. This brand identified you as a criminal for the rest of your life. You would never escape the stigma. Mutilation was used for various crimes. Thieves had hands cut off. Liars had tongues cut out. Poachers might be blinded or have ears cut off. These punishments were brutal, and without proper medical care, they often led to infection and death. Even if you survived, you would be permanently disabled, unable to work, forced to beg. Execution methods varied depending on the crime and the social status of the criminal. Hanging was most common for ordinary criminals. You would be led to the gallows, a noose placed around your neck, and hanged. Death was not instantaneous. You would strangle slowly, struggling for air, your body convulsing. It could take 10 minutes or more to die. Beheading was reserved for nobles. At least it was quicker than hanging, assuming the executioner was skilled. A single clean blow would sever your head. But if the executioner was incompetent or used a dull blade, it could take multiple strikes, each one an agony. Burning at the stake was used for heretics and sometimes for women convicted of murdering their husbands. You would be tied to a stake, wood piled around you, and the fire lit. The smoke would hopefully kill you from suffocation before the flames reached you, but not always. Some victims burned alive, conscious and screaming until shock or death took them. For the crime of high treason, men could be sentenced to hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most horrific punishment in medieval England. You would be hanged until nearly dead, then cut down. While still conscious, you would be disemboweled, your intestines and other organs removed and burned before your eyes. Then you would be beheaded and your body cut into 4 parts. These pieces would be displayed in different locations as a warning to others. The brutality was intentional. Treason was the ultimate crime, and the punishment was designed to be the ultimate horror. Gibbets, metal cages containing executed criminals, were displayed prominently outside towns. Bodies were left to rot in these cages, visible to all who passed. Birds would peck at the corpses. The smell was terrible, but this was the point. Everyone should see what happened to criminals. Your social status greatly influenced the justice you received. If you were wealthy or noble, you could often pay fines instead of facing corporal punishment. You had access to better legal representation. Judges and juries were more likely to believe your testimony. If you were poor, you had none of these advantages. You were at the mercy of a system that favored those with power and wealth. Women faced particular vulnerabilities. Accused of witchcraft, they had little hope of fair treatment. The judicial system was entirely controlled by men. Women could not serve on juries, could not become judges, could not be lawyers. Their testimony was valued less than men's. If accused, they had fewer means of defending themselves. The entire system was designed to maintain social control through fear. The brutality of punishments, carried out publicly, ensured that everyone understood the consequences of breaking laws. The message was clear: obey or suffer, and you had to obey not just the laws of the king and the courts, but also the will of your lord, because you were not truly free. The feudal system and your place in it. You are not your own person. You belong to the land, and the land belongs to your lord. This is the fundamental reality of feudal society, and it shapes every aspect of your existence. The feudal system was a hierarchy of obligation and dependency. At the top stood the king, who theoretically owned all land in the kingdom. The king granted large estates to nobles, who became his vassals. These nobles, in turn, granted smaller portions of land to lesser lords, who granted even smaller portions to knights. At the bottom of this pyramid were you and millions of others like you, peasants, serfs, villains. As a serf, you are not a slave. You cannot be bought and sold as property, but you are tied to the land. You are born on your lord's manor. You work his land, and you will die there. You cannot leave without his permission. You cannot move to another village, seek better opportunities elsewhere, or simply decide to try your fortune in a town. You are bound to this place, to this land, for life. Your obligations to your lord are extensive. You owe him labor. Multiple days each week, you work on his domain, his personal land, for no compensation. During critical times like harvest, you owe additional boon work. You cannot refuse these obligations. They are the conditions of your tenancy. You also owe various payments. When your daughter marries, you pay the lord a fee. When you die and your son inherits your tenancy, he pays a heriot, usually your best animal, or a sum of money. To use the lord's mill to grind your grain, you pay a fee. To use his oven to bake bread, another fee. To fish in his streams, yet another fee. These payments, combined with the labor obligations, mean that much of your time and production goes to enrich your lord. Your lord has significant power over your life. He administers justice through his manor court, settling disputes, enforcing rules, and punishing offenses. If you have a disagreement with a neighbor, the lord's court decides the outcome. The lord's word is law within his manor. Your lord can restrict what you grow on your assigned land. He can demand you use his facilities rather than building your own. He controls when and whom you marry. Marrying someone from another manor requires his permission and a payment. Your children inherit your status. If you are a serf, your children are serfs. There is no escape. Some peasants were freemen rather than serfs. Freemen had more legal rights. They could leave the manor if they wished. They paid rent in money or goods rather than owing labor. But they were still peasants, still poor, still subject to the same hardships of medieval life. Freedom meant a bit more legal autonomy, not prosperity or easy living. The church demanded its own share of your labor and production. The tithe, 10% of everything you produced, went to the church. This was not negotiable. Not paying the tithe meant excommunication, being cut off from the sacraments and the Christian community. In a society where the church controlled access to salvation, excommunication was terrifying. Additionally, you owed labor to the church. Church lands needed to be worked. Church buildings needed maintenance. You would be called upon to provide unpaid labor for these purposes. taking yet more time away from your own survival needs. Social mobility was nearly impossible. You were born into your position, and you would die in it. A peasant could not become a knight. A serf could not become wealthy. The social order was considered divinely ordained. God had placed everyone in their proper station, and attempting to rise above it was not only impractical, but potentially sinful. There were rare exceptions. Occasionally, a talented individual might be able to enter the church, which offered a potential path of advancement. An intelligent peasant boy might become a priest, possibly rising higher in the church hierarchy. But this was extremely rare and required extraordinary circumstances. For women, options were even more limited. A peasant woman could marry, which simply transferred her from her father's household to her husband's household. She remained subject to male authority throughout her life. The only alternative was to enter a convent, but this required a dowry and was therefore impossible for poor families. The weight of this system was crushing. You had no control over your life. Your time was not your own. The fruits of your labor were not yours. You existed to serve others, to produce wealth and food that enriched the Lord and the church. Your dreams, your hopes, your desires, these were irrelevant. And you were constantly reminded of your place. The Lord lived in his manor house or castle, a symbol of his power and wealth. The church built grand cathedrals and abbeys, magnificent structures that dwarfed your tiny hovel. These buildings proclaimed the vast gulf between their inhabitants and people like you. Rebellions did occur. The most famous in England was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands of peasants, enraged by new taxes and the restrictions of feudalism, rose up against their lords. They marched on London, killed officials, burned records of serfdom, and demanded an end to villanage. The young king, Richard II, met with them and promised reforms. But once the rebellion was dispersed, those promises were broken. The ringleaders were hunted down and executed. Nothing changed. The feudal system continued. The harsh lesson was clear. Resistance was futile and dangerous. So you lived with your chains, invisible but ever present. You could not leave, could not change your status, could not keep the fruits of your labor. You were trapped in a system that offered no hope of improvement. And to add insult to injury, you were kept deliberately ignorant. Education, literacy, and information void. You cannot read. You cannot write. You have never been to school, and you never will. Knowledge, that most fundamental tool for understanding and improving your world, is denied to you. In medieval England, formal education was the exclusive privilege of the wealthy and the clergy. Peasant children did not attend school. The very idea would have been absurd. Schools, such as they were, existed primarily to train boys for the church. Education meant learning Latin, studying scripture, and preparing for religious life. This had no relevance to peasant existence. Your education came from your parents. You learned by watching and doing. Boys learned farming from their fathers, how to plow a field, when to plant different crops, how to care for animals, how to repair tools. Girls learned household skills from their mothers, cooking, brewing, spinning, weaving, caring for children. These were practical skills learned through apprenticeship within the family. Some children were apprenticed to craftsmen, learning trades like carpentry, blacksmithing, or baking. But this was not common among the poorest peasants. Apprenticeships required payment to the master craftsman, money that desperate families did not have. and apprenticeships were typically found in towns, not in rural villages, where most peasants lived. Literacy rates among the general population were extremely low. Scholarly estimates vary considerably, but some suggest that less than 10% of the population could read, and even fewer could write. Among peasants, the rates were much lower, with some historians estimating perhaps 5% or less. For peasant women, literacy was virtually non-existent. The church controlled access to written knowledge. Monasteries had libraries and scriptoria, where monks painstakingly copied texts by hand. Books were incredibly rare and valuable. A single Bible might represent months or years of labor. These texts were written in Latin, the language of the church, which ordinary people did not speak or understand. The Bible itself was not available to common people. Church services were conducted in Latin. The priest read scriptures and performed rituals in a language you could not comprehend. You participated in Christianity without understanding the actual content of Christian teaching. You knew what the priest told you, and you had no way to verify his claims. Information spread through oral tradition. News, stories, and knowledge passed from person to person by word of mouth. Traveling merchants, wandering friars, and pilgrims brought news from other places. But this information was often garbled, exaggerated, or simply false. Rumors spread as easily as facts. You had no way to verify what you heard. Your understanding of the world was limited to your immediate surroundings. You knew your village, perhaps nearby villages, and the town you visited on market days. Beyond that, the world was a mystery. You had heard of London, perhaps even of Paris or Rome, but you would never see these places. Your entire life would unfold within a radius of perhaps 20 miles from your birthplace. Geography, history, science, philosophy, these subjects were unknown to you. You did not know the shape of the earth. You did not know how far away the sun was, or what caused day and night. You had no understanding of disease mechanisms, weather patterns, or the nature of matter. Your knowledge was purely practical, focused on survival tasks. Superstition filled the gaps in understanding. Why did crops sometimes fail? God's punishment, bad weather, curses from witches, alignment of stars, all were considered equally plausible. Why did diseases spread? Bad air, sins, demons. Without scientific knowledge, supernatural explanations predominated. This ignorance kept you powerless. You could not challenge authority because you lacked the knowledge to do so. When the priest told you that your suffering was God's will, that you should accept your lowly position, that rebellion against your Lord was a sin, you had no contrary information. The entire system depended on keeping ordinary people ignorant. The few who were literate wielded enormous power. They controlled access to legal documents, records, religious texts. They could read contracts and deeds. They knew what laws said. They had access to accumulated knowledge. This created an unbridgeable gap between the literate elite and the illiterate masses. Even numbers were challenging. The Roman numeral system was cumbersome for calculations. Arabic numerals would not be widely adopted until later. Peasants counted using practical methods, notches on sticks, piles of stones. Complex mathematics was beyond reach. Timekeeping was imprecise. You marked time by the sun, by seasons, by church bells ringing for prayers. There were no clocks. You could not tell precise time. Days were divided roughly into parts: morning, midday, afternoon, evening. This was sufficient for agricultural work, but reflected the general lack of precise knowledge. You knew the church calendar, the saints' days and holy days that structured the year, but you likely did not know the date. You might know what year it was if it was mentioned during church services, but historical dates were meaningless to you. You had no sense of historical timeline, of cause and effect across generations. History was stories mixed with legends, with no way to separate fact from fiction. This intellectual isolation was stifling. You could not improve your situation because you lacked the knowledge to imagine alternatives. You accepted the world as it was because you knew nothing else. The feudal system, the church's authority, the harsh conditions of life, all seemed natural and inevitable because you had no framework for questioning them. And even if you did question, you would keep such thoughts to yourself. Questioning authority, especially the church, was dangerous. Heresy could get you executed. Better to remain silent, accept what you were told, and focus on survival. Your entire intellectual life consisted of practical knowledge for farming, legends and stories told around the fire, and the religious teachings you received from the priest. That was the extent of your mental universe. No books, no education, no access to the accumulated wisdom of humanity. You lived in an information void, and you did not even know it. You did not know what you were missing, what knowledge existed beyond your tiny sphere. Ignorance was not just a lack of education, it was a cage. And while you struggled in ignorance, the weather itself conspired to make your life even harder. Weather, climate, and environmental challenges, you wake to find frost coating the inside walls of your home. It is June, but the summer has been cold and wet, day after day of rain and low temperatures. Your crops are stunted, rotting in waterlogged fields. You do not know it yet, but the harvest will fail. Winter will be hungry. In the medieval period, people were completely at the mercy of weather and climate. There was no meteorology, no forecasting, no ability to predict what tomorrow would bring. You planted your crops and hoped. You prayed for good weather, and sometimes the weather killed you. Climate varied significantly during the medieval period. What scholars refer to as the medieval warm period, roughly from 900 to 1300, appears to have brought relatively mild temperatures to Europe. This warming trend could have contributed to longer growing seasons. Historical evidence suggests vineyards flourished in southern England during this period. Agricultural production seems to have increased, potentially supporting population growth. But then the climate changed. Around 1300, temperatures began to drop. The medieval warm period ended, and conditions became colder and more unpredictable. Many historians believe this climatic shift contributed directly to the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Years of cold, wet weather devastated crops across northern Europe, and you would have no warning, no explanation, no understanding of why this was happening. One year might be fine, the next disastrous. The crops that grew well last year might fail completely this year. You had no way to predict or prepare. Storms could devastate your life in hours. A severe thunderstorm could flatten crops ready for harvest, destroying months of labor. Hailstorms could shred growing plants. Floods could drown entire fields. Your home, with its thatched roof and wattle daub walls, offered little protection. A strong storm could damage or destroy your house, leaving you homeless. Lightning strikes caused fires, burning homes and barns. with structures built from flammable materials and lit by open flames. Fires spread rapidly. A lightning strike could ignite an entire village. You would flee with whatever you could carry, watching everything you owned burn. Winter was a test of survival. Without central heating, without insulated homes, winter meant months of cold. The fire in your hearth provided some warmth, but never enough. The single-room house, with its dirt floor and drafty walls, remained bitterly cold. You wore every piece of clothing you owned, layered together, and still shivered. Gathering and storing enough firewood for winter was critical. If you ran out of firewood before spring, you would freeze. People did freeze to death in their homes during particularly harsh winters. The elderly and very young were most vulnerable, their bodies unable to withstand prolonged cold. Hypothermia was a constant risk. Working outside in winter, hands numb with cold, you could develop frostbite. Fingers and toes could freeze. Tissue dying, potentially requiring amputation. And amputation in medieval times, without anesthesia or antibiotics, was usually fatal. Spring brought its own challenges. The transition from winter to spring could be difficult, with late frosts killing early plants. Flooding was common as snow melted and spring rains fell. Fields would turn to mud. Rivers would overflow their banks, drowning livestock and destroying homes. You might find yourself wading through knee-deep water, trying to save what you could. Summer seemed like it should be easier, but it brought heat, without air conditioning, without fans. Summer days in a small, poorly ventilated house were stifling. You would work in fields under the blazing sun, sweating heavily, with no way to cool off. Heat stroke was a real danger. Dehydration killed people during summer work. Drought could be as devastating as flooding. If the rains did not come, crops withered. Wells and streams dried up. You would walk farther and farther to find water, carrying heavy buckets back to your home. Livestock died of thirst, and without irrigation systems, you simply watched your crops die and knew that starvation would follow. Autumn brought relief from summer heat, but also anxiety about the coming harvest. Would there be enough? Would winter be survivable? You rushed to complete the harvest before autumn storms and early frosts could ruin the crops. Natural disasters were interpreted as divine punishment. A severe storm was God's wrath. A drought meant God was displeased. This added a layer of spiritual terror to physical hardship. You believed you were being punished, though you might not know what sin had caused it. Churches held special services, praying for relief, making offerings to win back God's favor. Eclipses, comets, and unusual astronomical events terrified people. These were omens of disaster. When the sky darkened during an eclipse, people believed the world might be ending. They prayed desperately, certain that God was about to unleash judgment. You had no control over any of this. You could not predict the weather, could not prepare adequately, could not protect yourself from nature's extremes. You simply endured, hoped, and prayed, and through it all there was violence. Violence, warfare, and constant danger. The village bells ring frantically. Armed men on horseback are approaching. Raiders, you grab what you can, gather your children, and flee into the forest. Behind you, your home burns. Your livestock are driven away. When you finally creep back days later, the village is destroyed. Everything is gone. Medieval Europe was violent. Wars were frequent. Local conflicts between lords were common. Banditry was endemic, and ordinary people like you suffered the consequences. Warfare in the medieval period was not conducted by professional armies. When a lord went to war, he called upon his vassals and tenants to fight. You, as a peasant, could be conscripted to serve. You would be given minimal training, equipped with whatever weapons you could provide, and sent into battle. Your farming skills were irrelevant. Your survival depended on luck and the competence of your commanders. Medieval battles were horrific. Men fought hand-to-hand with swords, axes, maces, and polearms. Arrows rained down from archers. Cavalry charges crushed infantry. If you survived the actual fighting, you might die of wounds afterward, infected injuries that festered and killed slowly. If your side lost, you faced additional dangers. Fleeing from the battlefield, you could be cut down by pursuing cavalry. If captured, you might be held for ransom if you had anything worth ransoming. More likely, you would be killed or sold into slavery. Even if you did not fight yourself, war affected you. Armies needed to be fed. They took food from the countryside, requisitioning supplies from villages and farms. Sometimes they paid. Often they simply took your stores of grain, your livestock, confiscated to feed soldiers. Armies on the move were destructive. Soldiers looted, burned, and killed. Rape was common. Women and girls were brutalized. Men who resisted were killed. Entire villages could be destroyed by armies passing through, whether those armies were your own side or the enemy. Between formal wars, banditry flourished. Groups of armed men, sometimes former soldiers, roamed the countryside attacking travelers, raiding isolated farms, stealing whatever they could. You had no protection against bandits. There was no police force to call upon. You either defended yourself, which was difficult when bandits were armed and you were not, or you submitted and hoped they would not kill you. Traveling was dangerous. Roads were poorly maintained and often passed through forests where bandits hid. Merchants traveled in groups for protection, but ordinary people often had to travel alone, going to market, visiting family in another village, making a pilgrimage. All involved risk. You might be robbed, assaulted, or murdered along the way. Bodies were sometimes found by the roadside, victims of violence left to rot. Personal violence was also common. Disputes between neighbors could escalate to physical fights. Without a police force or effective legal system, people often took justice into their own hands. Feuds could last generations, families seeking revenge for past wrongs. Drunkenness contributed to violence. With ale being the standard beverage, many men were intoxicated regularly. Drunk men fought in taverns, in streets, at festivals. These fights could turn deadly. A brawl could end with someone beaten to death or stabbed. Domestic violence was widespread and largely tolerated. Men were considered the masters of their households, and beating a disobedient wife or children was seen as acceptable discipline. Women had little recourse. If a man beat his wife to death, he might face some punishment, but often the authorities looked the other way. Children were not safe from violence. Child abuse occurred, and children had no protection. They could be beaten by parents, by masters, if apprenticed, by anyone with authority over them. Orphans and abandoned children faced terrible dangers, vulnerable to exploitation and violence, with no one to protect them. Public executions and punishments were themselves spectacles of violence. Watching someone hanged, burned, or tortured was considered entertainment. Crowds gathered for executions. Children attended. Violence was normalized, an accepted part of life. Animals, too, suffered violence. Livestock were often treated cruelly. Working animals were beaten to force them to work harder. Cruel sports, like bear baiting, where dogs were set on a chained bear, were popular entertainment. The bear would be torn apart, and the crowd would cheer. You lived with the constant awareness that violence could erupt at any moment. An argument could become a fight. Strangers might be dangerous. War could descend on your village without warning. You had no security, no safety net, no confidence that tomorrow would be peaceful. The psychological burden of this constant danger was immense. The psychological toll every day. You wake up not knowing if this is the day you will die. Disease could strike without warning. An accident could kill you. Violence could find you. Your child might fall ill and be dead by nightfall. This is your reality. The psychological impact of medieval life would crush most modern people within weeks. The constant fear, the endless grief, the complete lack of control over your fate. These would break your mind. You would lose children. This was almost certain. Given 50% infant mortality and 30% childhood mortality, you would bury sons and daughters. You would watch them suffer and die, unable to help them, unable to save them. The grief would be overwhelming. And then you would have to continue living, continue working, because stopping meant starvation. Medieval people developed psychological defenses against this grief. They had to, or they could not function. Babies were sometimes not named until they survived their first year. A way of emotionally protecting parents from attachment to a child who would likely die. This seems cruel by modern standards, but it was a survival mechanism. Religion provided a framework for understanding suffering. Your pain was God's will. Your dead child was in heaven, or at least you hoped so. You suffered because you were sinful, and suffering purified you. You would be rewarded in the afterlife. These beliefs helped people cope with unbearable situations, but the cost was a life lived in fear. Fear of God's punishment, fear of hell. The medieval conception of hell was vivid and terrifying. Eternal torment, burning forever, demons inflicting endless pain. You believed this was real, that you might end up there if you sinned, and everything was a sin. Sexual thoughts, anger, envy, laziness, eating too much, failing to attend church, questioning authority. You were constantly told you were sinful, that you deserved punishment. This created enormous guilt and anxiety. Confession was supposed to alleviate this guilt. You would confess your sins to a priest, receive penance, and be absolved. But sins accumulated again immediately. You were trapped in a cycle of sin, guilt, confession, and more sin. Purgatory added another layer of fear. Even if you avoided hell, you might spend centuries in purgatory, suffering to purge your sins before entering heaven. The church sold indulgences, payments that would reduce your time in purgatory. This practice reflected the deep anxiety people felt about the afterlife. Death itself was terrifying, not just because it ended life, but because you did not know what came after. Would you be judged worthy? Would you suffer eternally? The church controlled access to salvation through the sacraments. Being excommunicated, cut off from the sacraments, meant being cut off from hope of heaven. This was a terrifying fate. You would witness horrible things. You would see people die in agony from disease. You would watch executions, see people tortured. You would encounter bodies, perhaps someone killed by bandits, or someone who died of plague and was left where they fell. These traumatic experiences would accumulate, with no concept of therapy or mental health treatment. The lack of understanding about the world also created fear. Thunderstorms were terrifying because you did not understand them. Eclipses seemed like the world ending. Strange lights in the sky were omens. Superstition interpreted everything as meaningful, usually as warnings of disaster. Belief in the supernatural was universal. You believed in demons, in witches, in evil spirits. You believed they could harm you, curse you, possess you. You carried charms and said prayers to protect yourself. But the fear remained. Walking alone at night, passing a graveyard, hearing strange sounds. All of this fed paranoia about supernatural dangers. Loneliness was not possible in the modern sense because you were never alone. But emotional isolation was profound. You could not discuss your fears or doubts. Questioning religious teachings was heresy. Complaining about your Lord was dangerous. You kept your thoughts to yourself, carried your burdens silently. The complete lack of control over your life created learned helplessness. Nothing you did mattered. You worked endlessly, and you remained poor. You tried to protect your children, and they died anyway. You hoped for good weather, and drought or flood came instead. Eventually, you stopped hoping. You accepted that life was suffering, that nothing would ever improve. Depression must have been widespread, though it was not recognized as an illness. You would feel hopeless, exhausted, unable to find joy in anything. But there was no treatment, no support. You simply continued existing, going through the motions of daily survival. Some people broke under the strain. They might become withdrawn, unable to function. They might become violent. They might lose touch with reality. Without mental health care, these people were seen as mad, possibly possessed. They might be confined, abandoned, or in some cases, executed. The constant pain, both physical and emotional, would wear you down. Modern people take pain relief for granted. You would live with toothaches, headaches, joint pain, stomach pain, with no relief. This chronic pain would affect your mood, your ability to think clearly, your interactions with others. The cumulative effect of all these stresses would be devastating. Modern people facing a fraction of these hardships develop PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders. You would face all of this simultaneously for your entire life, with no escape, no help, no hope of things improving. And you would watch others suffer just as you did. Your neighbors, your family, everyone you knew lived the same brutal existence. There was no one better off to give you perspective, to show you that life could be different. This was simply how life was. The psychological toll of medieval life was immense, relentless, and completely ignored. You were expected to endure, to continue working, to maintain faith despite everything. Complaining was seen as weakness or ingratitude to God. Modern people, with their expectations of comfort, safety, and hope for the future, would psychologically collapse in medieval conditions within days or weeks. The mental fortitude required to survive medieval life is something most of us simply do not possess. Why modern people would fail? Let us be honest. You would not survive medieval times. You, personally, would fail quickly. First, your body is unprepared. You do not have the physical conditioning to perform medieval labor. Plowing a field behind an ox for hours, swinging a scythe to cut grain all day, hauling water, chopping firewood. These tasks require strength and stamina you do not have. You would be exhausted within hours. Your muscles would scream in agony. You would develop blisters, then open wounds on your hands. You would not be able to keep up with the work required to survive. Medieval people built this conditioning from childhood. They developed calloused hands, strong backs, and the ability to work long hours through years of constant labor. You cannot develop this conditioning in medieval times because you need to start working immediately to survive. You would fall behind, unable to meet your obligations, and you would starve. Your immune system would fail you. Modern people have no resistance to medieval diseases. You have been vaccinated against some illnesses, but not against bubonic plague, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, or smallpox. When you inevitably contracted these diseases, your body would have no defenses. The mortality rates that killed 30 to 50% of medieval people would kill you. You would almost certainly die of disease within the first year. Even minor infections would kill you. Without antibiotics, a simple cut could become infected and kill you through sepsis. A tooth abscess could spread infection to your brain. Respiratory infections could become pneumonia. Your modern medical understanding would not help you because without modern medicine, knowledge is useless. The dietary shock would devastate you. You are accustomed to varied, plentiful food. Suddenly, you would eat bread, pottage, and little else. The lack of variety, combined with the poor quality and frequent contamination of food, would cause digestive problems. You would develop nutritional deficiencies within weeks. Scurvy, anemia, general malnutrition would weaken you, making you more vulnerable to disease and less able to work. The water would make you sick. Even knowing that medieval water was contaminated, you would eventually have to drink it, because ale might not always be available. When you drank contaminated water, you would contract dysentery or other waterborne diseases. Severe diarrhea would dehydrate you rapidly. Without intravenous fluids, you might die. The sanitation conditions would horrify you. You could not adapt to living with constant filth, with no toilet, no shower, no running water. The psychological distress of living in such conditions, combined with the physical reality of constant exposure to human and animal waste, would break you. You would become ill, disgusted, despairing. Your lack of practical skills would doom you. You do not know how to plow a field, plant crops, or harvest grain. You do not know how to butcher an animal, preserve meat, or brew ale. You do not know which plants are edible and which are poisonous. You do not know how to spin wool, weave cloth, or repair a thatched roof. Every task required for medieval survival is completely foreign to you. You would be helpless. Even if someone tried to teach you, learning takes time, and you do not have time. You need to produce food immediately. You need to fulfill your labor obligations immediately. There is no grace period for learning. You would fail at basic tasks. The language barrier would be significant. Middle English of the medieval period was very different from modern English. You might understand some words, but many would be incomprehensible. Communication would be difficult. Misunderstandings would be common. You would be seen as strange, possibly addled. Your modern attitudes would make you suspicious. You would question things that medieval people accepted. Why must I give the church 10% of everything? Why can't I leave this village? Why should I believe what the priest says? These questions would mark you as dangerous, possibly heretical. You would be watched, suspected, possibly accused of crimes. Your expectations of human rights, equality, and fairness do not exist in medieval times. You would be treated as less than human, as a beast of burden. The casual cruelty, the exploitation, the injustice, you would rage against it. But your anger would accomplish nothing except making your situation worse. The psychological impact would destroy you. The fear, the grief, the hopelessness. You are not conditioned to handle these things. Modern people have hope. We expect tomorrow to be better, or at least no worse. We expect medical care, legal protection, and social support systems. None of these exist in medieval times. When you realized that nothing would ever improve, that you were trapped in this life until death, your spirit would break. The cold would kill you. Your modern home is heated. You wear warm clothes. You have never experienced true, unrelenting cold. A medieval winter in a drafty house with inadequate clothing and insufficient firewood would be agony. You would develop hypothermia. You might freeze to death. The labor would cripple you. Within weeks, your back would be injured from constant heavy work. Your joints would ache. Your hands would be a mass of blisters and cuts. You would push through pain because stopping meant death, but eventually your body would give out. You would become disabled, unable to work, and then you would starve. Violence would find you. You do not know how to fight. When bandits came, when a neighbor attacked you, when conscripted into battle, you would be helpless. You would be injured or killed because you lack the skills and the hardness required to survive in a violent world. The birth rate and infant mortality. If you are a woman, you would likely die in childbirth. The odds are simply against you. 20% maternal mortality means 1 in 5 women dies giving birth. Without modern medical care, complications that are easily managed today would kill you. If you survived childbirth, you would watch your children die, which would break your heart and possibly your mind. The smell, the filth, the pain, the fear, all of it together would overwhelm you. Modern people are soft. We expect comfort. We expect safety. We expect that when we are sick, we will receive care. We expect that our children will grow up. We expect that hard work will be rewarded. None of these expectations would be met in medieval times. You would not last a day. Literally one day. The shock of waking up in medieval conditions would be so overwhelming that you would not be able to function. And if by some miracle you survived that first day, you would not survive the first week, and you almost certainly would not survive the first year. This is not an insult. It is simply reality. Medieval people were shaped by their environment, hardened by necessity, adapted over generations to survive in conditions that would kill modern people quickly. You are a product of a different world, one with comforts and protections that medieval people could not imagine. Removed from that world, you would be as helpless as a medieval peasant would be trying to navigate modern life. Conclusion tonight. We have journeyed through the harsh reality of medieval life. We have seen the sanitation nightmare, the constant disease and death, the struggle for food, the backbreaking labor, the horrific living conditions, the brutal justice system, the chains of feudalism, the enforced ignorance, the merciless weather, the endemic violence, and the psychological toll of living through it all. We have seen why you, as a modern person, would not last a day in medieval times. Your body, your mind, your skills, your expectations, all are products of a world with comforts and protections that did not exist in the Middle Ages. Removed from that world, you would be helpless. Medieval people were not happier or more virtuous than modern people. They did not have simple, pure lives close to nature. They suffered terribly. They lived in fear, in pain, in want. They died young, often in agony. Their lives were, to borrow the words of philosopher Thomas Hobbes describing the state of nature, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. We are incredibly fortunate to live in the modern world. We have running water, sanitation, antibiotics, anesthesia, education, human rights, and countless other blessings that medieval people could never have imagined. Yes, the modern world has problems, but those problems pale in comparison to the daily horror that was ordinary life in medieval times. So tonight, as you go to bed in your climate-controlled home, in your clean sheets, with a full stomach and the reasonable expectation that tomorrow will not bring plague or bandits or famine, take a moment to appreciate what you have. Appreciate the toilet, the shower, the antibiotics, the education, the choices, the freedom, the safety, the hope. You would not last a day in medieval times, but you do not have to. You live in a time of unprecedented comfort and security. Never forget how lucky you are. If you enjoyed this exploration of history, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment about where you are watching from and whether you think you could have survived medieval life. And as always, thank you for watching. Good night.